So that's been a short introduction to components, templates, how you can use multiple components, and how you build up your application of components. However, we're still outputting static text until now, and that isn't the most important thing, or the most interesting thing, isn't it? So it would be great if we could interact with the templates and output dynamic data there. If we could let our components interact besides passing HTML code from parent to child. If we could listen to events in the DOM, for example. Those are all very important things, so time to get to that. So this is of course about data binding, which basically means interacting with data, interaction between templates and business logic. Data binding means communication. It means that our component body, the logic, the class, the TypeScript code, interacts with the component template, the view which the user sees. And our component body passes data to this template, and there are different ways to do this. You will learn all of them, of course, and listens to events. As I said, you will learn all of them. So which data binding methods do we know or do we have? We got string interpolation, which has the following or this syntax, double curly braces, and then an expression which resolves to a string. And you already saw that in the first app where we output title between curly braces. Title was referring to a property of this component, which was a string. Therefore, we were able to output it because as it's written here, the expression you want to output has to resolve to a string in the end. Another way would be property binding. And property binding means you're binding, which means sending data to properties in your DOM, in your HTML code. Now there are different properties available, 3 kinds to be precise. And I will come back to that. One example would be to bind to the disabled property of a button. This is a normal DOM property. And then you'll need an expression. And notice that we don't have curly braces here. We just have quotation marks. And between the quotation marks, an expression which resolves to the type this property needs. So for the disabled property here, for example, true or false. But for other properties, you might need an expression resolving to a string or something like that. Kind of the opposite of property binding, where you send data to a property, here for example to the button property, would be event binding, where you listen to events emitted from an element, from something. Here, for example, we're listening to the built-in click property or to build click event. And this click event is available on a button, for example. It's available on each HTML element. And then between the quotation marks, you have the expression you want to execute whenever this event occurs. Now note that expression means that you could also set up a method which should be executed here. Or if it's a very short logic you have, you just define it inline in this code. The last thing is two-way data binding. And two-way data binding, of course, was one of the most important things for Angular 1, which made Angular 2 so very, very successful and popular. Angular 2, by default, doesn't have two-way data binding. By default, all data flow is unidirectional, which allows it to run it so fast and circumvent some problems. Nonetheless, if you need two-way data binding, it's still there. And the syntax is the one you see here. Squared brackets, then parentheses, and then ng model inside of that. And as you probably see, it's the combination of property binding, where you use squared brackets, and event binding, where you use parentheses. And this, of course, is no coincidence, but instead, it makes sense to mix both syntaxes, because two-way binding, as the name implies, is two-way. It is property and event binding in one single thing. Now, ng model is the keyword here you have to use, and then between the quotation marks on the other side of the equal sign, you set up the model. Could be a single property, could be a more complex object, and a field of that object, which you want to bind to this input field here, for example. Now, this would lead to the following behavior, where you enter text into this HTML input, and then the model in the code, the component body, would be updated. If this body would be, or if this object, this bound object would be updated somewhere else, this would also be reflected in the input element. So it's two-way, listening and sending it into. Of course, you will see all of these data binding methods in action throughout this module.